The last emperor of Rome died in a street fight, not on a throne, not surrounded by his court. He tore off his royal insignia so nobody would recognize him, picked up a sword, and ran toward the Ottoman soldiers pouring through the broken walls. They never found his body. His name was Constantine XI, and his empire had been standing for over 1,000 years before that morning. It had survived plagues that wiped out a third of the world, Persian armies, Arab conquests. It even survived being looted by fellow Christians who were supposed to be its allies. But on May 29th, 1453, it ended in a single day. This is that story. Most people think Rome fell in 476 AD. That's the date they teach in school. Romulus Augustulus, last emperor of the West, gets deposed by a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer. End of Rome. Except nobody told Constantinople that. The eastern half of the Roman Empire just kept going. Same emperor, same laws, same administration, same army. They didn't declare independence or start something new. They simply continued, the way you continue walking when the person next to you trips and falls. The people inside that empire never once called themselves Byzantines. That word was invented by a German historian named Hieronymus Wolff in 1557, more than 100 years after the empire was already dead. The people who actually lived there, who fought for it and built its churches and wrote its laws, they called themselves Romans, in Greek, until the very last day. That's the thing that gets lost when people talk about this. The Byzantine Empire isn't a replacement for Rome. It's Rome, the same institution running without interruption from Augustus Caesar in 27 BC all the way to Constantine XI dying in those streets in 1453. That's nearly 1,500 years of unbroken continuity, which is a number that stops making sense the longer you sit with it. And the reason it lasted that long, the main structural reason, was a city. Constantinople sat on a thin triangle of land with water on 3 sides. The only way in by land was from the west. And in 413 AD, Emperor Theodosius II built a wall across that western side that genuinely changed the military history of the world. 2 walls, actually, with a moat in front of both. The outer wall was 9 meters high. The inner one was 15. Towers every 55 meters. The whole thing ran for nearly 7 kilometers. For over 1,000 years, no army broke through it from the land side. The Huns tried. The Persians camped on the opposite shore and stared at it. Arab armies besieged the city twice and left empty-handed. Bulgarian Khans brought entire armies to those walls and turned around. The city fell exactly twice in its entire history. The first time, it was stabbed in the back by people who were supposed to be friends. The second time was the end. But between those 2 moments, there were centuries of history that most people have never heard of, and some of it is genuinely difficult to believe. The first time the empire reached something you'd call greatness was under Justinian I, who took the throne in 527 AD and immediately became obsessed with an idea that everyone around him thought was insane. He wanted the old empire back, the whole thing. North Africa, Italy, Spain, the Western Mediterranean, all of it reconquered and reunited under one Roman emperor. His advisors told him the treasury was thin, the army was stretched, and the Persians on the eastern border needed constant managing. He did it anyway. He gave the job to a general named Belisarius, who at this point was in his late 20s, had never commanded a major campaign, and was handed an army of around 15,000 men. Belisarius took North Africa from the Vandals in 533 AD. Not in a year, in a single campaign season. The Vandal kingdom, which had held North Africa for a century, was gone by the time winter came. Belisarius did it with misdirection, speed, and an almost inhuman ability to read a battlefield while it was still moving. Then he moved to Italy. The campaign there was longer. The Ostrogoths were harder to dislodge, and Justinian kept undercutting him with political interference and inadequate reinforcements. But by the late 540s, Byzantine banners were flying over Rome, Ravenna, and most of the Italian peninsula. Back in Constantinople, Justinian was building. The old Hagia Sophia had burned down during a riot in 532, a riot that nearly killed Justinian himself, and which his wife Theodora famously refused to flee from, telling her husband that purple was a fine color for a burial shroud. After the city was brought back under control, Justinian commissioned a replacement. What went up over the next 5 years was something that architects still argue about. The dome of the Hagia Sophia was 31 meters across and sat on a ring of windows that made it look, from the inside, like it was floating in midair. When it was completed in 537 AD, it held the record for the world's largest dome for nearly 1,000 years. When Justinian walked in for the first time, he looked up and reportedly said, "Solomon, I have surpassed you." He also spent his reign doing something quieter but possibly more consequential. He had every piece of Roman law ever written collected, organized, and turned into a coherent legal code, the Corpus Juris Civilis. It became the foundation of legal systems across continental Europe, and law students in France, Germany, Italy, and Spain are still working with its descendants today. But the campaigns broke the treasury. And then, something else broke everything. In 541 AD, a plague arrived in Egypt and moved west. It hit Constantinople in the spring of 542 and killed somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 people per day at its peak. Justinian himself caught it and survived, which was unusual. Across the empire and into Persia and Western Europe, somewhere between 25 and 50 million people died. Maybe a third of the Mediterranean world's population, gone in a few years. Military recruitment collapsed. Tax revenue collapsed. The reconquered territories in the west couldn't be held with what was left. The Lombards took Italy back within a decade of Justinian's death. The Visigoths retook Spain. Everything his generals had bled for, handed back. The dream of a reunited Rome died with Justinian in 565 AD. It was never seriously attempted again. What came after Justinian is basically a century of the empire getting punched repeatedly and somehow remaining standing. The Sassanid Persians, under a king named Khosrow II, launched the largest invasion of Byzantine territory in history, starting in 602 AD. In a decade of campaigning, they took Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and most of Anatolia. They captured Jerusalem in 614 and took the True Cross back to Persia as a war trophy. At one point, their army was camped across the Bosphorus, close enough to see Constantinople's lights at night. Emperor Heraclius responded by doing something nobody expected. He left the city, put the government in the hands of the church, borrowed money from the clergy, and took a small army east into Persian territory. Not to defend, to attack. He campaigned for 6 straight years, fighting his way through the Caucasus and deep into the Persian heartland, and in 627 AD, at a place called Nineveh, his army destroyed the Persian force sent to stop him. Khosrow II was overthrown by his own nobles shortly after. Persia agreed to return every conquered territory and send the True Cross back. Heraclius carried it into Jerusalem himself. It's considered one of the most remarkable military reversals in history. The man essentially saved the empire with a long-range raid when conventional defense had failed. And then, almost immediately, everything changed again. Arab armies, moving under the banner of a new religion, came out of the Arabian Peninsula in the 630s with momentum that nobody in the region had seen before. They destroyed the Sassanid Persian Empire entirely, the same empire that had just been defeating the Byzantines for decades, in about 15 years. Then they turned north and west. The Byzantines lost Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. Permanently. These were wealthy provinces, heavily populated, central to the empire's tax base. The Arab general Amr ibn al-As took Alexandria in 641 AD, a city that had been a center of Mediterranean civilization for nearly 1,000 years. The Byzantines tried to take it back, failed, tried again, failed again. The losses held. So the empire adapted, which is maybe the most underrated thing it did across its entire history. They reorganized the military, shifting from a professional centralized army to local forces called the theme system, soldiers who were given land in exchange for defending the territory they lived on. Cheaper to maintain, harder to destroy with a single defeat, and deeply motivated because they were fighting for their own farms and families. They also had a weapon that helped at sea. Greek fire, an incendiary compound that burned on water and couldn't be put out with water, destroyed the Arab fleet when it attempted to blockade Constantinople in 674 AD. The Arab navy came back in 717 and was destroyed again. The walls held both times. The empire that emerged from this period was smaller, Greek-speaking, religiously intense, and much better at surviving than the one Justinian had ruled. It looked almost nothing like ancient Rome, but it was still standing. The empire's second great peak came roughly 3 centuries later, under a dynasty called the Macedonians. The emperor who defined that era was Basil II, who ruled from 976 to 1025 AD. He came to power as a teenager during a civil war, spent the first decade of his reign fighting off 2 separate generals who wanted his throne. And then, once that was settled, turned his attention outward with a methodical brutality that earned him a nickname he probably would have liked. His main enemy was the Bulgarian Empire under Tsar Samuel. The two of them fought for nearly 20 years across the Balkans. Back and forth, siege and counter-siege, neither side able to finish it. In 1014, Basil trapped a Bulgarian army at a mountain pass called Kleidion. He captured roughly 15,000 soldiers. Then he had them blinded, all of them, except for one man in every 100, who was left with one eye so he could lead the others home. 99 out of every 100 men, their eyes put out in the field. When Samuel saw his army walking back toward him, he had a stroke and died 2 days later. Basil II inherited a depleted empire from civil war and handed his successor a state that stretched from the Danube to the Euphrates. He never married, never had children. He spent almost his entire adult life on campaign. He reportedly didn't bother with the ceremony and court ritual that Byzantine emperors were famous for, showing up to victory celebrations still in his field armor. While all of this was happening, Constantinople was by a significant margin the largest and most sophisticated city in the Christian world. Running water, hospitals, a university that dated back to the 4th century, a legal system that actually functioned, a trade network connecting England in the west to China in the east. London, in the year 1000 AD, had somewhere around 15,000 people. Constantinople had maybe 500,000. The gap between them was not a gap. It was a different category of human settlement entirely. After the Macedonian dynasty ended in 1056, the empire spent the next few decades doing what empires sometimes do when nobody's watching. It quietly ate itself. Emperors lasted months before being removed. The military aristocracy and the civil bureaucracy spent more energy fighting each other for control of the treasury than managing the borders. The professional army shrank because bureaucrats kept cutting its budget to fund their own networks of patronage and influence. In 1071, two things happened that changed the trajectory of everything. At a place called Manzikert in eastern Anatolia, a Seljuk Turkish army under Sultan Alp Arslan met the Byzantine force and won. That alone wasn't catastrophic. The Byzantines had lost battles before. What made it different was that Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes was captured in the fighting, a Byzantine emperor taken prisoner in the field. It had never happened before. Alp Arslan treated him well, negotiated a ransom and a peace treaty, and let him go. But while Romanos was still in captivity, his political enemies back in Constantinople had already declared him deposed and blinded him after his return. He died from the wounds shortly after. The Seljuks, seeing the chaos, poured into Anatolia and settled. They didn't leave. That territory, the Anatolian heartland, which had provided the bulk of the empire's soldiers and agricultural tax revenue for centuries, was gone. The same year, the Normans under Robert Guiscard captured Bari, the last Byzantine city in southern Italy, also gone. In a single year, the empire lost both its eastern and western buffer territories. What remained was Constantinople, the Balkans, and the coastlines. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos came to power in 1081 and stabilized things through a combination of political skill, military reform, and willingness to make uncomfortable deals. He understood that pushing the Turks back out of Anatolia required more soldiers than the empire could field on its own. So he sent a letter to Pope Urban II asking for mercenary fighters. What came back was the First Crusade. 100,000 Western Europeans, armed and moving, passing through Byzantine territory on their way to Jerusalem. The relationship between Byzantium and the Crusaders was tense from the first day. The Byzantines wanted organized military support that they could direct. What they got was an independent army with its own leadership, its own agenda, and very little interest in taking orders from a Greek emperor in Constantinople. The Crusaders thought the Byzantines were too clever, too willing to negotiate with Muslims, too Eastern to be properly trusted. The Byzantines thought the Crusaders were violent, unreliable, and useful only when pointed directly at a specific target. The First Crusade did recover some Western Anatolian territory for Byzantium, but it set the pattern for everything that followed. An alliance built on mutual suspicion that both sides knew could collapse at any moment. It collapsed completely in 1204. The Fourth Crusade never made it to the Holy Land. Through a series of political debts, financial pressures, and deliberate manipulation by certain Venetian interests, the crusading army ended up outside the walls of Constantinople instead, and then inside them. For 3 days, soldiers who had taken the cross to fight for Christendom looted the most Christian city in the world. Bronze statues that had stood since antiquity were melted down for coins. Sacred relics from the churches were crated up and shipped to France and Venice, where many of them still are. The Byzantine historian Nicetas Choniates wrote that the Muslims, the people the Crusaders had set out to fight, had shown more respect for Christian holy places than the Crusaders did in Constantinople. A Latin empire was established on Byzantine territory. The Byzantine court fled to Nicaea in western Anatolia and ruled from exile for 57 years. They retook Constantinople in 1261. But what they walked back into was a city that had been stripped, neglected, and half-emptied. The population was a fraction of what it had been. The trade networks were broken. The treasury was bare. The Genoese and Venetians had permanent trading concessions that cut into Byzantine commerce at every turn. The empire that was restored in 1261 was the same institution by name. In practical terms, it was a city-state with delusions of its former self. The last 2 centuries are hard to read. The Ottoman Turks, who had replaced the Seljuks as the dominant power in Anatolia, squeezed the remaining Byzantine territory steadily and without much drama. By the early 1400s, the emperor controlled Constantinople, a handful of coastal towns, and not much else. He was paying tribute to the Ottoman Sultan. Byzantine nobles were traveling to the Ottoman court to settle disputes with each other, because the Byzantine legal system no longer had the reach or authority to resolve them. Emperor John VIII made the trip to Italy in 1439, sat through the Council of Florence, and agreed to reunite the Eastern and Western churches in exchange for a promise of military support against the Ottomans. He gave up centuries of theological separation and came home with almost nothing. The Western aid that was pledged arrived too late and too small to matter. Back in Constantinople, the Orthodox clergy rejected the union immediately. The saying that circulated through the city afterward was, "Better the Sultan's turban than the cardinal's hat." The union collapsed. The help never came. When Sultan Mehmed II arrived outside the walls in April 1453, he had an army of 80,000 and artillery pieces large enough to knock holes in walls that had stood for 1,000 years. The city had maybe 7,000 or 8,000 defenders. Several hundred of them were Italian volunteers who came on their own without any government behind them. Constantine XI was offered terms. Leave the city, rule somewhere smaller, keep your life. He said he would not live as an emperor without an empire. The walls held for almost 2 months. Then a small gate, the Kirkaporta, a postern door in the northern wall, was left unlocked after a sortie. Ottoman soldiers found it, got through, and the defense unraveled from the inside. Constantine XI took off his imperial regalia and charged into the fighting. He was last seen alive, going into a crowd of Ottoman soldiers near the gate of St. Romanos. What happened to his body? Nobody knows for certain. Some accounts say it was identified later by the purple boots. Others say it was never found at all. By the morning of May 30th, it was over. Constantinople had been a Christian city for 1,100 years. Under Ottoman rule, it became Istanbul, the capital of a new empire, and the Hagia Sophia became a mosque. The city itself never stopped being one of the most important places in the world. What the Byzantines left behind takes a minute to actually account for. The scholars who fled west after 1453 brought manuscripts with them. Original Greek texts of Plato, Aristotle, Thucydides, Euclid, works that Western Europe had only ever encountered in Arabic translation. Those texts landed in Florence and Venice and Rome right around the time the printing press was becoming viable, right at the start of what we now call the Renaissance. The connection isn't clean, and historians debate exactly how direct it was, but the timing is not nothing. The legal code Justinian commissioned in the 6th century is still the backbone of civil law systems across continental Europe and Latin America. And the 1,000-year record of an empire that absorbed disaster after disaster, adapted, rebuilt, and kept going, that record exists. Most empires don't last 200 years. The Byzantine Empire, by any honest count, lasted well over 1,000. They called themselves Romans until the last man died. In the ways that actually matter, they weren't wrong. If you want more history like this, the kind that takes some digging to find, subscribe. There's a lot more of it. See you in the next one.